The night was merciless. The wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling the walls of Jonas's cabin with the force of an unrelenting predator. Snow battered the windows in thick, blinding flurries, and the trees beyond bent under the weight of ice, their branches cracking like brittle bones. This was no ordinary winter. This was the kind of deep, punishing cold that stripped the land of life, where even the strongest creatures of the wild hunkered down, waiting for the storm to pass. Inside the cabin, Jonas sat hunched near the fire, watching the flames dance, their flickering glow casting restless shadows across the wooden walls. His hands, calloused from years of chopping wood and working the land, hovered over the heat, trying to chase away the stiffness that had settled into his bones. He had lived alone in these woods for years, retreating from the noise of civilization, content in the solitude that the wilderness provided. But nights like these made even the hardest of men uneasy. The wind wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, a force that clawed at his sanctuary, whispering reminders of the vast, untamed world outside. Then came the noise, a sound so out of place that it sent a chill through Jonas that had nothing to do with the cold. A scraping, slow, deliberate, something dragging against the heavy wooden door. His first thought was the wind, maybe a loose branch caught against the cabin. But then it came again, this time deeper, more forceful, a slow, ragged scratching, like claws against wood. Jonas straightened, his heartbeat quickening. His eyes flicked toward the shotgun mounted above the fireplace, fingers twitching instinctively. He wasn't the only predator in these woods. He had seen bears before, huge, hulking creatures that ruled the land when the rivers weren't frozen over, when food was plentiful. But this was the dead of winter. A bear should be deep in hibernation, not scraping at his door like some lost traveler. The sound persisted, a thump heavy and labored, followed by a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down his spine. Something was out there, something big. Jonas rose to his feet, his boots pressing against the creaking wooden floor as he moved toward the door with slow, measured steps. He hesitated, listening. Beyond the wind, beyond the storm's fury, there was breathing. Ragged, shallow, desperate, his fingers curled around the shotgun stock, pulling it down from its mount with a practiced ease. He had lived too long in these parts to take chances. If this was a starving bear, it would see him as food. And if it was something else, something worse, he wasn't about to let it inside without a fight. But then the sound changed. The scratching stopped. A moment of silence. And then a weight against the door. A slow, heavy pressure, like something leaning against it, barely able to hold itself upright. Jonas's grip on the shotgun tightened, his breath catching in his throat. This wasn't normal. Bears didn't do this. They didn't beg. And yet, that's exactly what it felt like. A silent plea. The seconds stretched into eternity as he debated his next move. The rational part of his mind screamed to keep the door shut. Whatever was on the other side was weak, but weakness didn't mean harmless. If he let it in, he could be signing his own death warrant. But then the weight shifted again, a slow, exhausted slide downward. And a sound followed that Jonas never expected to hear from an apex predator. A whimper, a soft, pained sound that cut through the storm, through the fear in his gut, through every survival instinct that told him to walk away. Jonas exhaled sharply, his grip on the gun faltering. Damn it! Everything in him told him not to do it. But something deeper, something primal and instinctive, made his hand reach for the latch. Slowly, cautiously, he slid the lock back and pulled the door open just a crack, enough to see what lay beyond. His breath caught. There, standing in the swirling snow, was the largest bear he had ever seen. Its fur was thick with ice, its massive frame trembling with weakness. Snow clung to its body in frozen clumps, and its breath came in uneven puffs, fogging the air in front of it. But it was its eyes that stopped Jonas cold. Dark, intelligent, desperate. This was no mindless beast acting on instinct. This bear This thing knew exactly what it was doing. Jonas barely had time to react before the bear took a slow, unsteady step forward. One massive paw landed just inside the doorway, its claws barely scraping the floorboards as it swayed, barely able to hold itself upright. Its breath hitched, and for a terrifying second, Jonas thought it might lunge. But it didn't. Instead, it collapsed. A body that should have been a mountain of power and muscle crumpled like a broken thing, slumping forward onto the threshold, its head lolling to the side, its ribs heaving as if every breath was a battle. Jonas took an instinctive step back, shotgun still raised, unsure whether to act or run. But the bear didn't move. It lay there, its massive chest rising and falling in slow, shallow breaths, its limbs twitching as though even in unconsciousness, it was fighting something unseen. Jonas swallowed hard, his mind racing. What the hell was he supposed to do now? Leaving it outside wasn't an option. The storm would finish what hunger and exhaustion had started. But bringing a bear inside his cabin? That was lunacy. One wrong move, one moment of regained strength, and he'd be nothing more than a meal. And yet, something about this entire situation gnawed at him. The way the bear had come here, the way it had begged, yes, begged, to be let in, the way its eyes had locked onto his, not with the wild hunger of an animal, but with something else, something he couldn't name, something that felt almost human. Jonas stood in the open doorway for what felt like an eternity, his mind warring with itself. He had always trusted his instincts, had always survived because of them. And right now, those instincts told him one undeniable truth. This wasn't just a bear. This was something else. Something he couldn't begin to understand. And it was dying. Jonas tightened his grip on the shotgun, exhaled sharply, then made his decision. With one last glance into the night, into the howling, frozen abyss beyond, he took a deep breath and pulled the bear inside. The moment Jonas dragged the massive bear inside, he knew he had made a mistake. Not because the bear stirred, not yet, but because the sheer presence of the creature in his cabin seemed to shift the very air in the room. The flickering fire dimmed slightly, shadows stretching unnaturally long across the wooden walls, and the wind outside howled louder as if protesting his choice. But it was too late to turn back now. The bear lay crumpled on his cabin floor, its massive chest rising and falling in slow, uneven breaths. Up close, Jonas could see the extent of its suffering. Its fur was matted and thick with ice, patches of it missing in places, revealing raw, inflamed skin beneath. Its ribs were more pronounced than they should have been, a clear sign of starvation. Strange for a creature that should have been deep in hibernation. He should have been afraid. The gun was still in his grip, but somehow he couldn't bring himself to raise it. Something about the way the bear had collapsed, the sheer helplessness in its form, made it impossible to see it as a threat. Instead, Jonas moved carefully, keeping his distance at first as he gathered what little he had to help. He fetched some old blankets, laying them down near the fire before he turned back toward the bear. He hesitated. Then, cursing under his breath, he stepped forward and did something that went against every instinct in his body. He touched it. Its fur was coarse beneath his fingers, but ice cold, unnaturally cold. It made no sense. Bears were built for the cold, their thick pelts designed to trap warmth, but this one felt like it had been frozen from the inside out. He recoiled slightly, brows furrowing, then steeled himself and continued. Jonas worked quickly, cutting away the worst of the ice with his knife, peeling away frozen clumps that had fused to the creature's flesh. He expected resistance, a growl, a twitch of movement, something, but the bear remained still, too still. Jonas paused, placing a tentative hand near its snout. Faint warmth brushed against his skin. It was alive, but barely. For hours, he worked in silence, tending to the animal as best he could. He stoked the fire higher, tried to raise the cabin's temperature. He fetched what little food he had, mostly dried meat and leftover stew, unsure if the bear would even eat when it woke. He wasn't sure why he was doing this. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was curiosity. Or maybe it was that feeling in his gut that told him this was more than just a wild animal. At some point, exhaustion took hold. Jonas leaned against the far wall, his shotgun still within reach, eyes flickering between the fire and the beast on his floor. And then, as the storm raged on outside, he drifted into uneasy sleep. The first sign that something was wrong came in the middle of the night. A sound, not a growl, not the shifting of a massive body, a whisper. Jonas's eyes snapped open. For a moment, he wasn't sure if he had actually heard it or if it had been part of a dream. But then it came again, soft, distant, like a voice carried on the wind. Jonas pushed himself upright, his breath slow and steady. The fire had burned lower, casting deep, flickering shadows across the room. His gaze flicked toward the bear. It hadn't moved, or had it? Something felt different. Jonas swallowed, gripping his shotgun as he rose to his feet. He wasn't a superstitious man, but the air in the cabin felt wrong. He could feel it in his bones. The heaviness of something unseen pressing down on him, a presence that had not been there before. Then the whisper came again, this time closer, right behind him. Jonas spun, raising the shotgun, only to find nothing, just the empty room, just the wind outside. His pulse thundered in his ears. He exhaled slowly, running a hand down his face. You're hearing things. Lack of sleep. The storm messing with your head. That was all. But just as he was about to turn back, a sound, low, guttural, coming from the bear. Jonas tensed, watching as a massive form on the floor shifted slightly. A slow, strained movement. Then an exhale, deep and rattling. It was waking up. Jonas raised the shotgun, stepping back cautiously. The bear's breathing grew heavier, its body twitching. Then, with an agonizing slowness, it lifted its head. Jonas braced himself for aggression, for wild, instinctive panic. But what he saw instead froze him in place. The bear's eyes were open, but they weren't the eyes of an animal. They were human, dark, hollow, filled with something ancient. Jonas's grip on the shotgun tightened, his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't move. Neither did the bear. They simply stared at each other in the flickering light. And then it spoke. Not in words. Not in any sound Jonas could understand. But something in his mind shifted, as if a presence had reached inside him, brushing against his thoughts with a weight that did not belong. A single word bloomed in his head. Help! Jonas staggered back, his breath catching. His brain screamed impossible, but his gut told him otherwise. This was not a normal bear. This was something else. Something that had been waiting for him to open that door. Something trapped. Something desperate. And Jonas had just let it inside. Jonas stood frozen, his mind battling against the reality unfolding before him. The bear, if it could still be called that, held his gaze with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine, despite the heat of the fire crackling nearby. Those eyes, dark, deep, and impossibly human, seemed to see through him, as though peeling back the layers of his soul. His grip on the shotgun tightened. He had spent years in these woods, had encountered his fair share of strange and unexplainable things, but nothing like this. Nothing that spoke without speaking. His breath came in slow, measured exhales, his heart hammering in his chest. He wanted to convince himself that he had imagined it, that exhaustion and the howling wind outside were playing tricks on his mind. But deep down he knew this was real. The weight of the word that had surfaced in his mind, help, it had not been his thought. It had been something else, something inside him, planted there by this creature. The bear's body shifted again, muscles rippling beneath matted fur as it slowly tried to lift itself, but the effort seemed too great. Its limbs trembled, and after a few moments, it slumped back down with a heavy exhale, its breath ragged and uneven. Jonas took an instinctive step forward, then caught himself. What the hell was he doing? This thing Whatever it was should be dead, shouldn't be here, shouldn't be able to communicate. And yet, it had come to his door. It had begged. It had spoken. Jonas wet his lips, his throat dry. "What are you?" His voice was hoarse, the words barely escaping. The bear didn't respond, not in words. But something shifted in its expression, the corners of its eyes tightening as though struggling to comprehend the question. And then, as Jonas watched, the creature did something that sent a bolt of ice through his veins. It moved its paw, slowly, with great effort, toward the wooden floor, and began to write. Jonas felt the world tilt beneath him. His vision tunneled. The bear's claws, thick and blunt from wear, scraped against the wood with weak, deliberate movements. The strokes were uneven, jagged, but unmistakable. Letters. Jonas took a shaking step forward, his breath shallow as he read the crude, frostbitten script. C-U-R-S-E-D. A pit opened in his stomach. Jonas swallowed, forcing down the tightness in his chest. His mind screamed at him to run, to leave this thing to die, to get as far away from whatever unnatural force had found its way to his doorstep. But something else, something deeper, kept him rooted in place. For years, he had lived alone, convinced that the world had nothing left to offer him. He had seen cruelty, had witnessed betrayal, had lost everything that mattered. Solitude had become his shield. And yet, here he was, standing before something that should not exist, something pleading for help when no one else would listen. He exhaled, steadying himself. "What kind of curse?" he asked. The bear exhaled shakily, its massive body sagging as though relief had settled over it. Then the air around them changed. The fire flickered, the cabin walls seeming to stretch and groan as if pressed upon by something unseen. The wind outside stopped, and then Jonas saw it, not with his eyes, but with his mind. A flood of memories, not his own, crashed into him like a tidal wave. The story of the cursed bear. A long time ago, before the world had turned to frost and the land had been stripped of warmth, there was a man, a hunter, strong, respected, but arrogant. He had been warned about the forbidden lands deep in the northern forests, a place where the snow never melted, where the trees twisted unnaturally, where the air itself whispered secrets to those who dared venture too far. But he did not listen. He was a man of logic, of reason. He did not fear old stories. And so he went. Days passed, then weeks. He hunted, he tracked, he took, and they watched. The spirits of the land, the old, forgotten gods who had long been abandoned by men, saw his arrogance. They saw his greed, his lack of respect for the balance that held the world together. And so they punished him. They did not kill him. That would have been merciful. Instead, they changed him. Bone twisted, muscle stretched, skin became fur, and human breath became the heavy rasp of a beast. He did not die. He did not sleep. He became something other, something trapped between two worlds, a prisoner in his own body. For centuries, he wandered the frozen wilds, unable to speak, unable to die, a soul bound to the form of a beast, forever starving, forever lost. Until now, until Jonas. The visions faded, leaving Jonas gasping, his forehead damp with sweat despite the freezing air. He staggered back, clutching the edge of the table for balance. His mind reeled, his chest tightening. This wasn't just some random bear that had stumbled upon his cabin. This was a man, or at least it had been. Jonas's gaze snapped back to the creature lying before him, and suddenly he didn't see a predator. He saw a prisoner. The bear, no, the cursed man, watched him with exhausted eyes, silently pleading. Jonas's mind raced. If the spirits had done this, if ancient forces had cursed this man, what the hell was he supposed to do about it? He wasn't a shaman. He wasn't a priest. He was just a man who had chosen isolation over connection, who had spent years convincing himself that some things just couldn't be fixed. And yet, here was something broken, something waiting to be saved. Jonas exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face. "How?" he asked. The bear blinked slowly, then with great effort, dragged its paw across the floor once more, scratching out one final word. "Blood." Jonas stilled, his stomach clenched. He knew what that meant. A life for a life. A trade. It was the oldest form of magic, sacrifice. Jonas looked down at his calloused hands, then at the creature that had once been a man. The weight of the decision settled over him like a suffocating fog. To save him, to break the curse, would mean giving something in return. Something Jonas might not be ready to give. His blood, his life. The wind outside howled again, as if whispering its own warning. Jonas had spent so long running from life, from people, from connection. But now he stood at the precipice of something greater than himself. And he had to decide, would he turn away, or would he finally take a risk worth dying for?